That's a good sign. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our current series of classes from the Sandy Granite Family History Center. And tonight we're delighted to have with us a wonderful lady, and she's just a pleasure, and she's so easygoing, and she ducks at the right time when catastrophes hit like they did earlier tonight here, but whatnot. But we're excited tonight to have Catherine Grant around with us. And those of you that spend any time on the internet know that Catherine has done a lot of webinars, whatnot, a lot with BYU, through the BYU library. And there's some great ones out there, and you should spend some time and go out and check those out as well, because her classes are always very detailed and very thorough, whatnot. So it's a pleasure to have her with us tonight. I'm going to let her introduce the class to you. Before she does that, just a reminder that this particular class will be available 24/7 on the Sandy Granite Family History Center site, and I will post that in the chat. That web address is www.granitefhc.com. And you can go on our website there and check out the class, plus a lot of other classes that are warehoused there as well. So without further ado, we'll turn the time to the most wonderful Catherine Grant. Catherine.
Thank you very much. Apparently my bribery money is paying off, Bob. So thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Oh, Bob, of course, this goes right along with our evening. It says that the participant screen sharing is disabled. So if you were able to enable that.
Okay, I'm getting out my wrench.
Awesome. Yes.
And I hit the computer 4 or 5 times.
Did you ever see that old comic with it had Donald Duck with a mallet in his hand, and he was over the computer, obviously very frustrated, and the caption said, "Strike any key to continue."
I love it. Yeah, that's great. Okay, you should see it now.
Oh, it should be there. Gotcha. Okay. Yep, you're absolutely right. It is.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, sharing screen. There we go. You should be able to see my slide deck now.
Double trouble. What a great.
Awesome. It totally fits, doesn't it?
It really does.
Well, everybody, welcome to this class tonight. We're so grateful that you could join us, whether you're watching live or you're catching this recording later on. This, in my mind, the topic that we're talking about tonight is actually one of the most important in family history. So I'm grateful that you would take your time to participate in this class. We're going to be talking about avoiding the same name trap. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering in tonight's class. First of all, what is the same name trap? Just so that we can all be on the same page with each other. And then we will look at 2 case studies. The first one is Disappearing John, and the second one is the Prolific Gowers. In both of these cases, somebody got caught in the same name trap. So we'll take a look at how it happened and also what needs to be done to fix it, and how we figured out that 2 people really weren't the same when somebody thought they were. And finally, we'll have some tips for avoiding the same name trap. So what exactly is the same name trap? Well, very simply, it's assuming that 2 different people are the same person just because they have the same name. So for example, I might run across a John Chambers and his wife Elizabeth on a christening record. And then I might run across a John Chambers and his wife Elizabeth in a census record. And I just look at the names and I presume that they are the same person without any other evidence besides the name. That is the same name trap. Now, what's interesting is that we meet people in our daily lives that have the same name all the time. I have 2 friends named Dave Richards. I am betting that just about everybody who listens to this class knows 2 people that are different but have the same name. So I just want to open this up actually for those of you who are listening to, or actually who are on the call live tonight. if you could put in the chat, what are some of the ways that you tell people apart if they have the same name in real life, not in family history, but in real life? If you've got a couple of friends that are both named Peter Taylor or whatever, how do you tell them apart? And I'm going to be watching the chat. So I'll tell you one way that I tell my friends Dave Richards apart. One is that, as you can kind of see from this example, they look totally different. So that's an easy way that we tell people apart. But they also are very different as far as their family situation. One is married with children, one is not. Okay, Janice is saying date and place. Exactly. One of my friends, Dave Richards, is born in a certain year, and the other one is born in a different year. They live in different places, they have different jobs. So, in real life, when we're dealing with people that have the same name, we see a lot of clues that help us realize that they're different people, right? The interesting thing, though, is somehow when we get to family history, we kind of throw all that out the window and we just rely on names. And the thing is that these clues are available to us in historical records. We can see where they lived. We could see when their birth year was. We could see who their family is. But for some reason in family history, a lot of times those facts get ignored. So here's a real life example from Family Tree. I got a duplicate suggestion for John Chambers and his wife Elizabeth. If we compare them to icebergs, right now we're looking at the part that's above the water, right? It's exactly the same on both people, and that represents their names. So just looking at it this way, we go, well, yeah, everything looks identical. But let's look below the surface. So when I checked out this duplicate, this suggested possible duplicate in Family Tree, I found a child attached to each couple. Look at the children and tell me if these couples can possibly be the same person. And please feel free to post your answer in the chat for those of you who are attending the live class.
They still kind of could be.
So what is your reason for saying that they could be? I'd love to hear your explanation of that.
Well, sometimes people get their fingers on the wrong keys. So somebody might have said that 1758 was supposed to be 1858, and or 1864 was supposed to be 1764. So you could maybe look and see if there are sources that say those really are their birthdays.
Okay, that is a really good suggestion. So you should verify the record. And in this case, the sources match the dates. So these dates are correct and these locations are correct. So very good point, because you're right. There could be typos or bad merges that mess up the information. But in this case, knowing that this information is correct, is there any way that these two girls could be siblings?
No.
No, kind of not, right? I don't know of any woman whose childbearing years were over 100 years. It just doesn't happen. Maybe in the, pre-Methuselah era in the Bible or something. But in our era, all the women we know do not have childbearing years of over 100. So since these girls, so they're born over 100 years apart, they're born on completely different continents, not even like the same country, although different counties. They're like across the ocean from each other, in addition to being over 100 years apart. So if there's no way that these girls are sisters, then there's no way that their parents are the same people. So just again, as a reminder, Family Tree suggested John and Elizabeth as duplicates of each other. So when you get a duplicate hint, you always want to do your own sanity checking just to be sure. So we discovered by looking at the facts that these two people are not the same. These two couples can't possibly be the same person. And so we were able to avoid the same name trap. So why do we care? Now that we've seen a little example of it, some people watching this video might be saying, what's the big deal if we mix up two people? Well, especially if you're working in family tree, which is a shared tree, there are a number of problems if we confuse two different people who have the same name. It can cause bad merges because we see the same or we see two different people, but we don't maybe look carefully enough, and we go, oh, they've got to be the same, so we merge them together, and then all the problems that come with bad merges happen, like incorrect sources and incorrect relationships. In fact, I think that's the next one. Yeah. When we confuse two people with the same name, we can end up with the wrong kids joined to the wrong parents. We can get incorrect record hints because in family tree, that's family tree record hints, the hinting algorithm depends on the information on the person page. And if that information has gotten messed up through a bad merge, then you're going to see bad record hints. In fact, I remember one time hearing a couple of people, where we were in an online discussion, and a couple of people were saying, wow, family search's hints are not very good. They bring up hints that don't apply to the person. And another very talented participant and researcher, her name is Amy, had worked with this a lot. And so she actually was able to give her perspective. And she said, do you know what? Almost all the time when I've seen a bad record hint, it's because the information on the page is bad, having been corrupted through bad merges and so forth. So Family Search's record hinting is actually very good. In my experience, it's probably about 95 to 98% accurate unless the information has been messed up by a bad merge. The same name, if we fall into the same name trap, that can also cause duplicates. That might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but imagine that you've got person A, let's say Dave Richards, just using my friend's name. So we've got person A, Dave Richards, and person B, Dave Richards, and they're not the same person, but somebody comes along and merges them, and person A is the survivor, and person B is hidden inside the bad merge. Well, then somebody else comes along and they look for person B, but they can't find them because they're hidden in a bad merge. So they create another Dave Richards person B because they think that that Dave Richards is not in family tree, but he really is. So confusing two people with the same name can actually cause duplicates. And finally, these problems tend to snowball. And I've seen this so often in family tree that once there's a couple of bad merges done on a family, that leads to bad record hints, which leads to bad relationships, which leads to more bad merges. And the merges snowball throughout the family and down through generations. I think the most I've seen is probably 3 generations where bad merges just messed up all the generations. So yeah, avoiding the same name trap is a great way to avoid all these types of problems. So, general tips for avoiding the same name trap. I wanted to just go over these briefly before we head into the case studies so that they'll be in your mind as we're looking at these case studies. One of the most important ones is simply to be patient. Usually, in my experience, the reason that people merge or confuse two people who are not the same is because they're rushing too fast. They're either trying to get something done really quickly, or they're just in the habit of thinking, oh, family history is so easy now. We just do it 1, 2, 3 very fast. You don't need to do research. Unfortunately, that's a misconception that has been promoted by some well-meaning individuals. And so whenever people rush, that's when they're more likely to confuse two people who have the same name but are not the same person. Also, being observant. So as we looked at those two, Anne and Anna Chambers, if we hadn't paid attention to the birth date and the birthplace and any sources that were available, we might have just glossed over it and said, oh, same names of parents, same names of child, they must be the same. So be observant to those little details that actually you don't really have to dig for. They're just right in front of us, and we just need to pay attention to them. Also, using common sense and logic, like we talked about in the Chambers example, women in in post-biblical days and ages do not have childbearing spans of over 100 years. It just doesn't happen. So by common sense, we could tell that those two families were completely separate. It's always a good idea to err on the side of caution. Let me give you a funny was actually shared by a fellow teacher named Ted Black at the BYU Family History Library. He came across a merge in a changelog, and the person for the reason statement on the merge had said, I don't think these two people are the same, but I'm going to merge them anyway to clean up the tree. So that's a really extreme example of confusing two people and doing it intentionally. Most of the time, I think it's unintentional, but we just do tend to jump to conclusions maybe a little more often than we should. And so we'll merge two people unless we have a strong reason not to. What's a better approach is to not merge them unless we have a strong reason to, unless we've got the strongest possible evidence that they really are the same person. People being badly merged is one of the biggest problems in family tree as far as messing up the data and messing up our families. So one thing I did want to point out is sometimes people will hear things like this and they'll go, oh, I can't sort out people that have been mixed up because they have the same names because I'm not a professional genealogist. I wanted to be very clear that you actually don't have to be a professional genealogist. I'm not. I'm a teacher and a writer. So I love family history, but I'm not a credentialed genealogist. So you don't have to be a credentialed genealogist in order to be patient and be observant and use common sense and to be cautious. So it helps to be familiar with the area where you're researching, but just know that you already have the ability to avoid the same name trap and to even solve same name problems as long as you are exercising these characteristics right here. And we are going to go through a little bit more detailed ones towards the end, but I think overall, these are some of the most important. Okay, let's look at a case study of disappearing John. I'd like to introduce you to John Horridge, who is on my line. He was born about 1844 in Bolton, Lancashire. His parents are James and Ellen, and by occupation, he is a miner. He works in the coal mines. It was fairly easy to find him in the census. And any of you who might have seen some of my classes before, you know that one of my favorite research helps is called the timeline grid. And it's just a simple table that it's used for time periods and countries that have censuses, which England does at this time we're looking at. So we've got one column per census, and then we've got one row per person. And it basically gives us a snapshot of the family. So here's John. He's 7. He's living with his parents in 1851. By the time he's 16, bless his heart, he's already a coal miner. Difficult life. He's still living with his parents. By 1871, he's still single and living with his parents, but his sweet mom has passed away and his dad has remarried. So in 1871, he's living with his dad and his stepmom, single and a coal miner. Well, I wanted to find his wife because, well, if he had one, I wanted to figure out if he had married. So I looked all over the place and I did all these creative searches and, wildcards and blah, 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 trying to find him beyond 1871. No hint of where he was. I could not find him. So I decided to go back to Family Tree. And this actually brings us to the next point. Remember when I talked about looking at what's right in front of us? Guess what I found in Family Tree? Went back. He's already got a wife in Family Tree and he's got 2 kids. So I think, okay, that is going to help me find him in the 1881 census. So let's take a look. And I looked and found him very easily, not in the 81, but in the 91. So here's John with his wife, Betty. Seems like a lot of Horridge people were named John and Betty, hence the same name trap, right? But this family was very easy to distinguish because of Carletta's unique name. So here they are. What do you notice about this John compared to the John that I first introduced you to? And you can go ahead and put it in the chat if you'd like to. And if you're like me and don't remember the previous screen, here's the problem. Well, at least some. So this John is born in 1847, whereas our guy was born in 1844. Not only that, this guy is born in Prestwich, whereas our guy was born in Bolton and sometimes in Brightmet. Brightmet is a part of Bolton, or at least very close to it, if I remember right. I looked it up on Google Maps. So we've got a little bit of difference here. They could still be the same. Maybe there was a mistake on the census, or maybe we look up Prestwich and we find that it's very close to Bolton and we feel that it's not a problem. But those inconsistencies are giving me pause, right? Well, I know that my John is a coal miner, and usually once they got into coal mining, it was very difficult to leave. So I want to look in the 1891 and see what this guy's occupation is. He's not a coal miner. He's in the cotton business, which was also a working class business that once you got into it, you tended to stay there. You tended not to go. So now I've got three things that aren't lining up. Let's look at a comparison. We've got different birth years. So here's our original John that we know is right, the son of James and Ellen. Here's the guy that is showing up in historical records as the husband of Betty and father of Carletta. Different birth year, different birthplace, different occupation. I'm starting to get a little bit concerned. So the final proof so those are red flags, but they're not absolute proof, right? So we want to look for some final proof. Well, remember that we had already found our John Horridge in 1871, living with his dad and his stepmom. Thanks to Carletta's unique name, and she was born just before 1871, it was actually pretty easy to find her with her family also in the 1871 census. So here are John, Betty, and his little daughter, and bless her heart, with a beautiful, unique name like Carletta. It seems like in every census I found, it was something different. She just, her poor name got like totally mixed up all the time, but close enough that it was clear that they were the same people, same family. So the fact that these two families appear separately in the same census is definite proof that they are not the same family. And so the next question we have is the wrong John joined to those parents, to James and Ellen, or is the wrong wife joined to the son of James and Ellen? So we need to go back to family tree. And I did want to make a comment here. Because of time constraints on this class, I'm not going into step-by-step details of how you would do all these steps over here. We're going to keep it at a high level, but if you're interested in the step-by-step detail of what you do in a case like this, we're actually going to have a class on this coming Sunday. The date that this webinar was recorded is April 19th. So on April 24th, 2022, at the BYU Family History Library online, we are going to have a class on the steps involved in untangling these kinds of problems. It's at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. If you're hearing this recording after that time, there is going to be a recording of that class on Sunday. So just visit the BYU Family History Library page and you will either find the link to the upcoming class or find the recording of the class if it's passed by the time you hear this information. So the first thing we want to do is verify who this John really is. Was he intended, created to be the husband of Betty, or was he created to be the son of James and Ellen? Well, I got in the changelog and found out that he was definitely meant to be the son of James and Ellen. It was actually one of my stake members who had created John. And so we knew that John was intended to be the kid of this couple. And when my stake member first put him in, she did not join any wife because she had not been able to find, neither she nor I had been able to find the wife. And then somebody else came along and concluded that because Betty Yates married a John Horridge, that it must be this one, and joined Betty to the wrong guy. So we verified the intended identity of John. And the next task is we need to disconnect Betty and her kids from this John because that's not her husband. And then we want to connect Betty and her children to the right John if he's already in family tree. If he's not, we would be able to create him. But as I recall, these kids were from christening records. And so the correct John actually was in family tree. And it was just a matter of getting the wife and the kids connected with him. And then the last step is that you want to go through, or what we wanted to do to avoid this happening again was to get the right wife attached to our John Horridge. And fortunately, as we kept searching, we ultimately were able to find the right wife. Her name's Mary Massey, and they had some kids of their own. And so now it's probably a lot less likely that somebody would come along and confuse those two John Horridges. So that's how we resolved this issue in this case study. Are there any questions, you guys, at this point? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no, and we are going to the prolific Gowers. So this was another time that I was meeting with one of my stake members. For anyone who may be not a member listening to this, not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, my current assignment at church is to help people with family history, which is really fun. So I was helping somebody in our area with family history, and we got onto this page, and whoa, 20 kids. Oh my goodness. Now, it's not impossible, right? There have been couples that have had 20 children. One couple, like one husband and one wife, it can happen, but it's so unusual that it's a bit of a red flag that we would want to check out. And indeed, as we started to check on this, we're noticing something very interesting. And I'm not sure how large the screen is for you, whether these dates are very easy to read, but let's take a look. This family, if these kids all belong to this couple, had 6 sets of twins. Not only that, they had a set of triplets. And this was back in the day before fertility treatments. This was back in the 1700s. So the chances of this happening, while they're not completely impossible, they're very, very unlikely. So we want to get in and check and see if we can determine if these kids really do all belong to this couple. Well, we start to see something very interesting as we look at the kids' birth years and birthplaces. We're not going to go through all 20 kids. I bet you're relieved to hear that. But let's just look at the first 6. So we start out with the oldest boy being born and christened in Malden, Essex. Then we're in a different county in 1791. Well, not impossible. People did move, although not as much as we do now in our very mobile society. Back then, it wasn't that frequent, but it did happen. So maybe the family picked up and moved to Shropshire for work reasons, or they were visiting family, who knows. But then we come to the third child who is also born in 1791, but they're born in a completely different county yet again. They're in Worcestershire, the county that gave Worcestershire sauce its name. Well, we would kind of think if they were moving, maybe they'd finally settle down because how hard is it to travel with 3 babies, right? But all of a sudden in 1792, they're back to Malden. And then in 1792, the same year, they're suddenly back to Shropshire. And then in 1793, they're suddenly back to Worcestershire. So they're kind of, according to this family, if it's correct, they're like cycling through, kind of having kids in counties as they tour England. How likely is that? It's like almost, it's astronomically unlikely. And here's a map. I found that it was, if I can get the screen to advance, there we go. It was helpful for me to start plotting the kids out to see how they actually fit very logically as individual families in the individual locations. So here, instead of having a couple of kids born within the same year, which again is not impossible if you have a January baby and a December baby, but it's very unlikely. And that poor mom getting pregnant again when she just gave birth 3 months ago. So very unlikely. But here we see 89, 92, 94. That's all making sense. 91, 92, 94, reasonable. Thomas and Mary, 91, 93. So it's looking like these are probably separate families that lived in separate areas, and they just happened to have parents who had the same names. And indeed, as we looked at the christening records, that's exactly what we found. These families were completely separate. The family stayed in the same parish. So you could tell by tracing that family through that they did not move all over England having kids in all three of these counties. So it turned out, as I recall, too, to the best of my memory, because it's been a while since my stake member and I worked on this, but I believe there were actually 4 or 5 families that were mixed together. And the problem was they all had a parent named William. Also, another thing was sometimes they were Gower and sometimes Gowan with an N. But somebody had just assumed, since the names were close, that they must be the same. So they had merged a boatload of William Gowans and Gowers together and a boatload of Sarahs. And as I recall, we added this name later after we figured it out. But when the bad merges were done, they just had Sarahs and Sarah Anns. And so a bunch of them were merged together. Well, if you've done any research in England in the 17 and 1800s, you know that William and Sarah are extremely common names. So the fact that those kids had parents with the name of William and Sarah was not enough to distinguish them as individuals. And hence, multiple people actually fell into the same name trap and combined about 4 or 5 families. And so we end up with this William and Sarah having 20 children. So the way to fix it is, first of all, undo the incorrect merges on these poor parents, get those sorted out. Then after the incorrect merges are undone, you look at all of them and make sure that you remove the kids that don't belong to those couples, and that then you add the kids that do belong to those couples and do any correct merges that need to be done. And then finally, the last step is to clean up the sources, because in bad merges, the sources get transferred to the surviving person, whether they're right or not. So that's a great final step in repairing a bad merge, is to go in and clean up all the sources. Okay, we are to the final part of our class tonight, and that is tips for avoiding the same name trap. We went over these key characteristics at the beginning: be patient, be observant, use common sense and logic, and err on the side of caution. But here are a few more specific tips. Be aware of naming patterns in your family and in the area where you're researching. In many cultures, especially from the 1500s to the 1900s, they weren't real creative with names. They just kept using the same names over and over and over again. And it's not bad or good or right or wrong. It's just how the culture was. So here are some examples. In Sweden, you're going to see a lot of Annas and a lot of Maries, a lot of Lars, Nils, Hans. In Mexico, you'll see Maria and Diego, Jose, Juan. In England, you'll see Mary, Elizabeth, Jane, or Sarah, John, Henry, William, or James. People used a lot of the same names. So if you're working in these time periods, be especially cautious, because there are so many people who are not the same, but still have the same names. Also, be aware of naming patterns within a family. You might think that the name Francis Bescaby is very unique, and you would be right, but it got used over and over and over again in my Bescovy family. I have to think, I haven't found him yet, but I have to think that when the Bescovy name first came into existence, supposedly it started in France. When it first came into existence, there must have been a guy named Francis who was just amazing. And everybody kept naming their kids Francis throughout the generations. I mean, clear from the 1700s down to the 1900s, we have Francis Bescovys on that line. So there are Francises that have very close birth dates and very close birth locations, but they are not the same people. But it would be easy to think, oh, that's such a unique name, they must be the same. But it isn't always the case. So you still have to be careful, even if it's a very unique name. Getting to know the family really helps. And we talked about just briefly this tool called the timeline grid. We won't go into detail, but here are some more resources. And at the end of this class, I'll give you a link to this slide presentation. I'll put it in the chat so that you can have this information. And this is a clickable link. So it just helps to know your family, know where they lived, know if they moved around a lot or if they stayed in the same location throughout the years and even throughout the generations. It helps so much to have that context of knowing the family. Also, watch for inconsistencies. They can pop up any place. For example, we saw that those two John Horridges had different birth years, different birthplaces, and different occupations, which were a pretty strong signal that they weren't really the same person. You can also look for inconsistencies in relationships, a different spouse, or if they even have the same spouse's name, like I've had relatives in England that had, like, I can't remember, shoot, who was it? It was Edward Bescovy married, his first wife was named Emma, and so was his second wife. So, but they had different surnames. So you can look at different spouse surnames, watch for different names or numbers of their children. You can pay attention to sources. So for example, if the 1911 census says that a family had 12 children, but you get into family tree and they've got 13, then one of those kids might have been added by a bad merge due to the same name trap. So that would be worth checking out. And then also, again, pay attention to logic. So siblings born less than 9 months apart, not absolutely impossible, but very, very rare. Children born before grandparents, that one is impossible. So just look for those inconsistencies, and those will give you clues that two people with the same name really aren't the same person. So by way of summary, tonight we talked about what the same name trap is. It's assuming two different people are the same person just because they have the same name. We went through our case studies, Disappearing John and the Prolific Gowers, and then we ended up with tips for avoiding the same name trap. So this is all that I have for tonight. Does anybody have any questions? And while we're waiting for questions, I'm going to go ahead and grab the link and throw it in the chat.
I put that one link, Catherine, to
Yeah.
you Sunday.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you,
Look over
Bob.
there. Yeah,
Oh,
it's in the chat.
that was brilliant. Thank you for doing that.
And that way they can at least get there and see that class and others as well. So
Yeah. Yep, that was a great idea. That did not even occur to me. So let's see. I am going to say this is the link to slide deck. Why is it saying I misspelled link? How hard is link to spell, you guys? Okay, there we go. Okay, so that link in the chat will go to this slide presentation that we just looked at, and all the links in it are live. So if there are no questions, then we're done for tonight. And thank you so much for your participation.
thank you as usual. Again, Catherine, we appreciated it. And it's very, very well done. I know
Thank you.
I get sucked in sometimes by that.
We all do.
And sometimes you want to believe it so badly that, but you can't do that.
Yeah,
So
it would solve so many problems if these people were the same. I want them to be the same.
they better be.
Yes.
Catherine, I have to tell you a worst case story.
Yes, Robin, tell us.
So a few years ago, there was a woman who decided that all of my Johann Heinrich Franks were the same one. and she merged 7 of them together.
Oh, Robin.
And
Oh,
then
dear.
she said, oh, but I don't think this is the same as my Johann Heinrich Frank. So I'm going to take mine off of there. And she
Okay.
left all of them merged.
All of
But she
yours.
took all of mine, but she took hers off.
I'm
So
so
there
sorry.
were 56 children, over 100 sources. It took me a year and a half to straighten all of that out.
I believe that. People don't often realize how time consuming it is. Like, you can do a bad merge in about a minute. Seriously, if you just fly through, and in fact, even 30 seconds, if you fly through and don't look at stuff, as you know, Robin, I'm not saying anything you don't know, but it takes, like, let's say, a minute to do a bad merge. But as you just pointed out, it took you a year and a half to sort out all the problems that happened from those bad merges. So yeah, it's a good thing to avoid the same name trap. Thanks for sharing your horror story. We can relate.
Thank you all. And again, if you want to see or watch this class again, the link is there for you to go to, and the link to the Family History Center is there as well. Whatnot for you to view. So thank you all again, and we'll see. We have another class next week if you'd care to join us. So good night.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. You guys, thanks for coming. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.